Good evening. I invite you to take all your seats, please, and we'll just start momentarily. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Victoria Williams. I'm a program officer here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're pleased to host this evening's discussion on the security of America's electoral systems. We'd like to extend our gratitude to Cambridge Global Advisors for their assistance with tonight's program, particularly to Jacqueline Hauser and Morgan Ryan. I would like to introduce our panelists shortly, but before we begin, please note that we are on the record and we are live streaming. We welcome social media, but please limit them to just Conferences.io, which is our way of interacting online by submitting your questions during Q&A. And you can go to your internet browser and type in chi.cnf.io. Please note that the views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Council. The Council on Global Affairs is a membership organization, and if you are a member, thank you for your support, which helps us to continue to produce affordable, accessible, independent content. Membership starts at just $100. Our upcoming programs are listed on either side of our screens, but you can also go on our website and be able to list and see a great list of our programs online. This evening, our panel will examine an issue of critical importance to the United States democracy and national security, the vulnerability of electoral systems to external interference. Our panelists will discuss the scale of this threat and how the federal government should respond. With midterm primaries only a few weeks away in some states, this is a timely and important subject. And we are glad to be joined this evening by a panel of experts, but unfortunately, two of our panelists, Sabra Horn and Tanya Siegel, will not be able to attend tonight, but nonetheless, we are excited with today's discussion and are excited with the panelists that will join us for the conversation. But with that, we are glad to be joined by our panelists. We have Greg Bales, who's a community outreach coordinator in the office of U.S. Senator Dick Durbin. He serves as Dick Durbin's liaison to elected officials, businesses, community organizations, and other constituencies throughout the Chicago and Metro region. We also have Richard Driggers. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Cybersecurity Communications at the Department of Homeland Security. In this role, he supports the development and implementation of operational programs designed to strengthen the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. We also have Ambassador Doug Liu, who is the Senior Fellow in the Future of Democracy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center, a Senior Advisor also at Cambridge Global Advisors, and is a former career Army officer and also a former U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO. And our moderator today is Jake Braun. He is the CEO of Cambridge Global Advisors. He is the faculty member of the University of Chicago's Harris School, where he teaches cybersecurity policy, and also a former White House liaison to the Department of Homeland Security, where he develops policies and programs related to national security and cybersecurity. So our discussion will be followed by audience Q&A. And with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists for this evening. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thanks. Hello, welcome. Thanks for having me. As was mentioned, I'm Jake Braun. I teach cyber policy at the University of Chicago, and I'm the CEO of Cambridge Global Advisors. And first, I want to thank the Council for having us here today, and Evo as well. Just to put in a plug for the organization, I think maybe one of the more relevant things is I'm on the President's Circle, and it's actually got a lot of benefit, and I really encourage everybody here and anybody watching to join, because it's definitely worth every penny and all the time you put into it. So with that, I think it's actually fitting that we're having this event here in January in 2018, because the first event I did on election security last year was in January on this stage at the Council, when I think a lot of people were trying to figure out what's going on with hacking the elections and so on and so forth. And that panel, which I think was one of the first in the country, was really the first one saying, what the heck just happened? Just trying to get a sense of really what's going on in the country, what did Russia do, and so on. And since then, a lot's happened, and we've kind of in many ways come full circle. We were talking about this coming in. And I think this event today is relevant for several reasons, but let me just kind of walk you through what's happened since the first event we did here in January of last year. So since then, DEF CON, the largest hacker conference in the world, got their hands on a bunch of voting machines and was able to hack into them within minutes. The first one they got into within minutes remotely, so didn't even have physical access to the machine and was able to hack into it within minutes. Every machine at the conference was taken down by the weekend, and the hackers were so shocked at how vulnerable the machines were, they were playing tricks on them by the end, getting them to play like cat cartoons and play music and stuff like that. It was pretty scary. But subsequent to that, we did a report. One of the big things about DEF CON is transparency and so on. So myself and the hackers at the conference put together a report on all the vulnerabilities we found and released that at the Atlanta Council in October. And at that event, we said that somebody, and we were going to help with it, needs to come up with best practices on how folks can, specifically election administration officials, can secure our elections. And frankly, before any of these other big, think tanks, government, federal government institutions, or anybody else was able to put out a best practice plan, the Cook County Clerk's Office here in Illinois, without, to my knowledge, anybody asking, put together what we believe is frankly one of the best election security programs in the entire country, and I think was the first released. And so we, at the University of Chicago, released that plan that was authored by Noah Pretz, who's here, who works for the Cook County Clerk's Office, and his team, and they rolled that out right before the holidays at the University of Chicago. And so now, after we've first we're here saying, what the heck just happened, then went to, well, okay, let's see what the vulnerabilities are, then released the vulnerabilities, and some folks came out with some pretty impressive plans to tell us what we should do about them. We're back here today to talk about what is the federal government actually going to help state and locals and the rest of the country do to protect our votes and our democracy in this space. So it's actually not an accident that we're here having this conversation today. It's to our knowledge, we did some looking into this and we think we're right. This is the first time that we've had both the executive branch and the legislative branch together publicly talking about this issue and about what both sides, or two of the three parts of the federal government, are going to do to protect our elections. And on top of all that, Illinois is one of the first states in the country to vote in the primaries of 2018. Illinois and Texas are the first two states that I'm sure you all know vote starting in March. So with that, I think our panelists were introduced, so I'm not going to make you all listen to that. Again, I will turn it over to former Ambassador Doug Lute to talk about the national security implications of election security.
Well, thanks, Jake, but also to Ivo and the console. I'm not in the president's circle, but I'm going to find out how one goes into this. Sounds like a good thing, right, to be in the president's circle. Look, my main point today is really quite simple, and that is that we are missing the main message of Russian interference in our 2016 election campaign. I think, as someone who spent 40 years of my adult life in the national security arena, what happened in 2016 in our election process is as serious a national security threat, as serious a threat as any I've seen in my 40 years, either in active duty in the military or in the White House or in the diplomatic service. And I say that because physical attacks on America, and if you think back, depending on your age here in the room, 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, look, you suffer tragic damage. But it's physical damage, it's loss of life, it's loss of property. We are strong enough to recover from that. It's still tragic, but we can recover from physical attack. The attack I'm worried about is the one presaged in 2016, which could erode the confidence in our election system. This is the connection between the voting public, the individual voter, and the democratic process that has that voter contributing to an election result, the election of an official. If we lose confidence as Americans in that, I think that loss of confidence, that erosion of confidence, is a more serious threat than any physical attack the United States has ever suffered. Now, I want to try to make that case in 5 quick points. Why is this so serious? So first of all, it's a proven threat. I mean, what happened in 2016 has happened. All 16 national intelligence agencies, frankly, for the first time in my 40-year career, agreed on something, okay? And this in itself is newsworthy, okay? But they agreed that not only were there hacking attempts and penetration attempts in our voting system, right? But that Russia was responsible and that the decision had been taken at the head of state level, Vladimir Putin. That is unusual for the United States intelligence community to come together like that without dissenting views and to agree on something. In the military, a threat is defined as a capability to do something and the intent to do it. So a threat is capability plus intent. Well, Putin passed that standard, okay? He meets the definition of a threat because he obviously has the capability. We know that they tinkered with, attempted to interfere with 21 state voter registration systems. And we know that he clearly has the intent he's demonstrated. So Putin is here, it's demonstrated, it's not academic, and we're not talking about a theoretical problem here tonight. We're talking about something that actually happened. So this is a proven credible threat. We would never, by the way, accept this level of vulnerability in any of our other key national security systems. Think about our nuclear capabilities. We would be outraged if they were as vulnerable as our election system just proved to be, or our command and control systems, or even our personnel systems, our personnel security systems. And yet, we haven't quite yet awakened to the vulnerability of our election systems. The second reason this is a national security threat is that Russia's not going away. Look, also in March, Illinois holds primaries, Russia holds national presidential elections. This is not very suspenseful. We know Putin's going to win. He will go from 2018 for another 6-year term. He is not going away. Even if he had an unfortunate physical accident in one of his heroic outdoorsman performances on horseback or hunting tigers or whatever he does in his free time, okay, the leader who replaces Vladimir Putin, because of the nature of the Russian state, will be very much like Vladimir Putin and will have to be like that in order to stay atop this steadily declining state structure. We will have an autocrat in Russia for the foreseeable future, probably the rest of our lives. So Russia is not going away. I think the attacks in 2016 can be characterized as probing attacks. They were actually, in some ways, quite clumsy and elementary. They were kind of sophomoric, okay? But one thing about Russia, they learn. He will have taken lessons from 2016, and he'll come back at us, because he's not going away, in 2018 and 2020. When he does come back, they will not be as clumsy. They'll be more targeted and more sophisticated. So it's not going away. Third, others are watching. This isn't as though we have only one potential opponent here in Vladimir Putin and Russia. Iran, North Korea, China, the so-called Islamic State, all have cyber potential. And quite frankly, our election system proved to be so vulnerable that we might even have disaffected domestic groups who attempt to weigh in on election security. Fourth, time is short. Jake's already mentioned, we're just months away from the beginning of the 2018 election season. 2020 is just behind that, and we are way behind the power curve in terms of corrective, defensive measures given the severity of this threat. And then final point is that, we as Americans tend to think, well, this is all about us. Well, there are actually a whole set of other democracies, our closest allies around the world, who also hold elections and who are also vulnerable. So you have European allies, Asian allies, whose democratic processes could be just as potentially vulnerable as ours. So this is a national security threat for all those reasons. And so to follow on Jake's intro, it's really interesting tonight that we bring the executive branch, the Department of Homeland Security to the panel, but also a representative of the legislative branch to really answer the fundamental question, what is the US government, if this is a national security threat, if you're persuaded by my argument, right, then what is the what is the branch of government, the level of government responsible for dealing with national security? The federal government, right? What is it going to do about this? And so I'm anxious to join my panelists here tonight.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here. My name is Rick Driggers. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Cybersecurity and Communications Office out of the Department of Homeland Security. Our department is responsible for eliminating threats to the nation's critical infrastructure, and with the designation of the election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, that includes the election systems as well. As was pointed out by both the ambassador and Jake, we understand that Russian activities to undermine the 2016 presidential elections. It's been well documented. We know that those threats are out there. We know that they're going to continue, and there's going to be other threat actors that are going to try to undermine future elections. The question is, what are we doing now, and what are we going to do going forward to preserve the confidence of our election systems? Given the role that elections play in a free and democratic society, on January 16th, as I mentioned, or January 6th, 2017, the Secretary of Homeland Security determined that election infrastructure should be designated as critical infrastructure. The designation means that the election infrastructure has become a priority in our planning and our policy efforts, as well as how we allocate our resources, and it also enables the department to prioritize cybersecurity services that we provide to state and local officials, but only those state and local officials that request support from the department. Finally, the designation provides protections for sensitive vulnerability information for the federal government to share with key stakeholders, which includes state and local officials. Since 2003, the Department of Homeland Security has been working really across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors that are outlined in the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, as well as working with owners and operators and state and local officials to secure or enhance the security of our nation's critical infrastructure. We've developed joint exercises across communications, the information technology, the energy, the financial services sectors to enhance our incident coordination procedures, and we've also streamlined access to classified and unclassified information for critical infrastructure owners and operators by partnering with information sharing and analysis organizations. Now more than ever, our efforts to support state and local government officials in the security of the election infrastructure is critically important. Elections, we see that as a vital national interest. Cyber attacks on this country, as was pointed out, are becoming more complex, and they range from not only nation states, but also cyber criminals and hacktivists, and they're becoming certainly more persistent, more sophisticated, and more dangerous. The digital and connected world has reshaped our lives. Common tasks have been streamlined, and the way that we communicate has changed. The continually evolving digital age has improved our quality of life for certain, but it's also changed the threat landscape, and it's also expanded the adversary's attack surface to do damage. We certainly haven't been resting on our laurels. We've been engaged with the elections that took place last year, the special elections, and certainly the Senate and congressional elections in Alabama and Utah. And we are operationally posturing ourselves to support, from an interagency perspective, the state and local elections, the state and local official cybersecurity efforts going into the primary, special, and general elections throughout 2018. Our department has engaged local and state and private sector stakeholders across the infrastructure, the election infrastructure spectrum, to increase and expand awareness of potential vulnerabilities and to enhance security of the U.S. election infrastructure. We also continue to offer state and local governments our cybersecurity services, which include cyber hygiene scans of internet-facing systems, on-site risk and vulnerability assessments, technical assistance, information sharing, and incident coordination resources. We also participated with our own hackers in the voting machine hacking village at DEF CON 25. We remain very interested in working with the vendor community and security researchers to understand vulnerabilities, share vulnerability information, and mitigation tactics. DHS has over 130 cybersecurity and protective personnel throughout the state that are at the ready to provide actionable information and connect election officials with tools and resources for cybersecurity preparedness of the election systems, as well as physical site security of voting machine storage and polling places. In addition, DHS is sponsoring secret-level security clearances for Secretary of States as well as state senior election officials to facilitate the passing of classified information. I referred earlier to the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. That's referred to as the NIP. The NIP outlines or calls for a sector to have two councils. One of them is government-focused. That's a government coordinating council. The other one is a sector coordinating council, which is private sector-focused. We've already established the Government Coordinating Council that is made up of the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and as well as the Department of Defense and key state and local election officials. They met late last year and established goals and objectives. They developed a plan for the Election Infrastructure Partnership, as well as laid the groundwork for developing the Election Infrastructure Sector Specific Plan. DHS is also working with the Election Assistance Commission to foster the development of the Sector Coordinating Council, which will include representatives from the voting machine vendor community, private sector security experts related to embedded systems security, as well as other relevant private sector partners. At DHS, we recognize that in the United States, elections are run by the local election officials. They have already taken a number of steps to secure their election infrastructure, and our efforts are meant to support, not replace those. The fundamental right for citizens to be heard by having their vote accurately counted is at the core of the American values. Ensuring the electoral system processes are secure is a vital national interest. We have confidence in the overall security of the electoral system, and our voting infrastructure is diverse. It's subject to local control and has many checks and balances. As the threat environment evolves, the department will continue to work with state and local partners to enhance the understanding of the threat and to provide essential physical and cybersecurity tools and resources available to the public and private sectors to increase security and resilience across this particular space. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll turn it over to Greg.
Thank you. Well, again, my name is Greg Bales. I'm here from U.S. Senator Dick Durbin's office. You may have seen him in the news lately. He was on The View, actually, this morning. I haven't watched it yet, so. He is the assistant Democratic leader. He's number 2 ranking member in the Democratic caucus of the U.S. Senate. And voting rights, voting issues, electoral issues are a top priority for him. Something we've been looking at is Illinois in specific. And I think it's probably helpful for the audience and those watching from home to get a reminder of the history behind why we're here and why we're talking about this. It goes back to 2002. It also goes back to 2016. It was 2016, I believe it was August, when it was publicly reported that Illinois and Arizona were the 2 states that had been hacked by a foreign entity. Illinois State Board of Election, their voter registration files had been compromised. It is alleged, it's been stated that it was Russia was the actor who did this. Fast forward after the election, mind you, voter registration rolls are separate from voter tabulation. So it is the consensus that voter tabulation was not interfered with. It is voter registration in those databases. So fast forward after the election, national intelligence agencies did come to a consensus that we'd been hacked. That's January 2017. We started taking a particular interest because we were one of the 2 known states at the time. And as Doug noted, it ended up being 21 states that have been compromised. That May, we worked with the Illinois General Assembly with Illinois State Senator Michael Hastings. He's the chairman of the cybersecurity subcommittee in the Illinois Senate. They had a hearing with the State Board of Elections, tried to get some answers. What happened? Who'd you talk to? What did you find out? We found out how much voter information had been compromised, social security numbers, home addresses, what localities, was there a pattern? Fast forward to June, we partnered with the state senator to send a letter to all 108 local election authorities. There's 102 counties in Illinois 109 local election authorities. The example would be City of Chicago has its own election authority. I think it's helpful to understand how we do have a decentralized electoral system. Every local election authority has some jurisdiction with how they operate their elections and what equipment they buy and what they use. Many of you probably are aware, Illinois, in our local election authorities, we have paper records, even if you're casting on your vote on an electronic screen. Some states don't have that paper trail. So we reached out to local election authorities and we said, were you hacked? What do you do to prevent a hack? Do you follow any of these cyber hygiene protocols? What can we do to help? At that time, we had recently sponsored legislation that would create funding for local election authorities, that would promote increased communication between those local election authorities and people like DHS. I'd say the big takeaway from the responses we got was they needed more money. So I talk about 2016, I talk about 2017. Let's go back to 2002 when the Help America Votes Act passed. We voted for it. It created a funding stream for local election authorities to improve their systems. I can't speak for certain on Illinois, but many states actually haven't even spent all that money. And so fast forward now to 2018, they still need new equipment. A lot of them haven't bought new equipment in a long time. And so what is the role of Congress? What should we be doing? Recently, legislation was introduced called the Secure Elections Act. There's a lot of pieces to that. The list is, making sure state leadership is working with federal government, ensure there's quick information sharing between local, state, and county election authorities, provide security clearances when necessary to local election authorities to be able to share information. There's hopefully develop a panel of independent experts to create an open process, provide grants to states for implementation of cybersecurity guidelines and replacing that outdated electronic voting machines like the ones that we just heard were tinkered with or hacked in Las Vegas. So we think that kind of stuff is important. We think there needs to be better coordination between all branches of government on this. I think this latest bill, which we will likely co-sponsor, is of value. It's bipartisan. Senator Klobuchar, Senator Langford, a Democrat and a Republican. We want to be working together on this because voting is a bipartisan American issue. It is an issue we all need to be working to protect. And we need to make sure that no outside actors like Russia are meddling in this very important process in our democracy. So we're excited that DHS is engaged. It was in January, as was noted, that they did declare it, our election systems, part of our, what's the term here? Critical infrastructure. That includes things, as you mentioned, our electric grids and things like that. So this is good stuff that we're working together. There needs to be more, and I'll turn it over to Jake.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. So I guess I'll go to my very first question. It speaks to what I think is really a challenge of kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole that I think pretty much everybody on the panel has alluded to, which is that if you have a nation state, which is an existential threat to the United States, which Russia is, and they are trying to attack certain parts of our critical infrastructure or the foundation of our democracy, which is voting. That is a national security issue, obviously. And so who does national security? Well, the military, Homeland Security, NSA, CIA, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's who does national security. Well, who administers elections in this country? State and local governments, obviously. Noah from the Cook County's office here, I think will tell you, I think his great line is, if the Russians invade, we're not going to call out the Illinois National Guard to fight them off. We're going to be calling NATO and everybody else. And so if the local election officials are going to be administering elections, and we want to keep it that way, we don't want to have DHS start administering elections, but we're not going to have local election officials start securing our country from existential threats, then how do you guys actually make this thing work? And I'll go to you first, Rick. How do you actually, without imposing undue restrictions and so on the state and local governments, how do you actually secure our elections?
Yeah, it's a complex issue. There's no doubt about it. It's a complex issue for one reason, because the election infrastructure is so distributed. And there's so many coordination points, even in just one state, let alone getting down to the county and the local and the township level. It's a very complex from that perspective. This is why the designation of the election infrastructure as a critical infrastructure allows us to certain authorities that the Department of Homeland Security has to provide state and local officials, election officials with certain tools and services, read them into classified briefings and things of that nature. It allows that to happen. It also allows us to share vulnerability information with them, and that information is protected from all kinds of different things, regulatory use and things like that. But it also creates what I alluded to earlier when I was talking about these different councils. So we have these coordinating councils that are set up. One of them is government focused, and I read the list of those government entities that are part of that. And the other one is bringing in the private sector. So this is, there's three legs on this stool. There's the vendor community, and there's the private sector entities that are developing these systems, that are updating these systems, that are in some states have, are on contract to protect and respond if there is some type of incident and monitor. There's the state and local officials who are, quite frankly, in charge of the election and in charge of the election infrastructure, and we want that to be like that. And then there's the federal government that can bring all of the national level assets, the intelligence community, the threat information, as well as some additional resources and subject matter expertise to bear. And it's making sure that from a coordination perspective, all of that is working well, that we have a lot of transparency across those three entities, and that we are actually providing the services that are needed at the state and local level so that we can make the election infrastructure more secure than it has been.
So let me just respond, although I'm neither an election official nor a cybersecurity expert. But look, this, in just plain English, this comes down to a couple simple steps. Number one, get the machines off the internet. There is nothing on the internet today, from your home Wi-Fi network to the Office of Personnel Management at the federal government to Sony to Equifax, right, which is secure on the internet. I mean, we all know that. Okay, so get our voting system off the internet. It's not necessary to be shiny and new and cool. This is too important. Get it off the internet. That's number one. Disconnect from the internet. Number two, protect the voter registration rolls. The easy target here is not to change the tally in some precinct in Cook County or the city of Los Angeles. It's to delegitimize or disenfranchise complete groups of people, because you can go in and corrupt the registration database, which means that the voter with his driver's license doesn't even get to the ballot. So stop them at the front door. Don't worry about tinkering with the votes. Stop them at the front door by corrupting the big database, right? The big soft target here, in military terms, are the registration databases, right? And then finally, move to paper. Now, I got to tell you, as a layperson in this arena, saying in the 21st century, 2018, go back to paper ballots seems counterintuitive. It seems like it can't possibly be the way to go. It is the way to go because A, it takes you off the internet, and B, it leaves you with what's required to do an audit. So that if we do those three steps, off the internet, protect the registration databases, and create an audit trail, we will go a long distance to being much more well defended against the sort of things we saw in 2016. So this is not rocket science. In fact, I should know if you'd stand up one more time. Cook County, we are here in Cook County in part because your system is a national example for the kind of hygiene and defensive steps that ought to be taken by all, something like 8,000 NOAAs around the country. But NOAA's a leading voice here, and you should feel good about voting here in Cook County under his guidelines.
Yeah, there you go. So to that point, I mean, there's some very specific next steps, and I think one of the big questions, Greg, is how is Congress starting to think about this? I mean, this is, paper ballots are actually not that expensive, but a lot of this other stuff is. So, there's multiple bills out there. Is Congress going to put up the dollars necessary to do everything that needs doing?
Well, we're struggling to fund the government through Friday right now. And to come back to the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, we did do that before, and we did it in a bipartisan manner. And the bill that I talked about earlier and the others, there is a funding mechanism that we want to support, and it has bipartisan support. I think there can be movement. I think if there's enough pressure, you can get some consensus. And it is not unprecedented, as in HAVA, to set some stipulations on what the procurement process looks like. I would agree with Doug on the paper ballot piece. And the voter registration piece, you're absolutely right. In HAVA, they included a thing about provisional ballots, which, if you've ever been unfortunate enough to have to cast a provisional ballot, that's when you show up on election day and you're not on the voter registration roll. You can still cast a ballot, but the onus is on you to come back and prove that you are who you are. And the percentage of people that do that or are able to do that is difficult. Illinois, we're very fortunate to have some pretty good voter registration laws, and in fact, we even just passed through automatic voter registration, which helps, but other states don't always have as easy or as accessible of systems. So I'm going to be optimistic that Congress can come around to this, but there's some headwinds we're battling in Washington against it, and we'll see.
I mean, are there certain things like the paper ballots that you see gaining steam in Congress, or this protect the voter registration databases, all that type of stuff?
With the legislation that's out there now, I don't believe that there's anything that sets a stipulation on what you purchase, and that procurement piece in dictating what type of machines you buy, I don't think we're there yet. I think we need to force that conversation. And I think we're hopefully going to start, and it's conversations like this that'll make it happen.
But look, we should be frank here, right? I mean, the amount of money we're talking about, granted from the federal government down to the people who do the voting, right, administration, people like Noah, right, is a rounding error in our defense budget. It's a $700 billion, I'm a defense guy, okay? They paid my salary for 40 years, it's great, okay? But it's a rounding error. We're talking about hundreds of millions against a $700 billion defense budget. So if this is really a national security issue, then let's take our green eye shades off and let's put on, and let's stare into the sunlight that this is a more severe national security issue than any of that $700 billion is going towards, in my view. And I'm a military guy.
So to that end, Doug, I think you mentioned before, there's a bunch of other democracies that are at risk as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we've seen in Western Europe in the last year and so on?
So first, this didn't start in 2016, right? I mean, Russia's predecessor was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did all sorts of things in terms of sponsoring opposition, at that time communist parties, across our Western European allies and so forth. But more recently, Russia openly sponsored and funded the opposition, a party which did not win the elections in France, but openly funded the Nationalist Party in France. I mean, they even went as far and won the most recent NATO ally, the small little Balkan country of Montenegro, to try to take over by force of arms the parliament building. Okay? So, I mean, this is just nuts. So there is Russian interference at multiple levels. In our case, trying to learn creatively about our election system and its vulnerabilities, but this goes all the way through violent measures, it goes through hacking, it goes through misinformation. We know now, we're beginning to learn, we're beginning to scratch the surface of how our social media networks were used to spread misinformation and how that was used to further influence our electoral politics, right? And I think, look, as Americans, we only have to look at Washington right now and ask, was the attempt in 2016 to gridlock Washington and to cast doubt on the credibility of the American electoral process. Did it work? Well, from Arlington, Virginia, which is just across the river from Washington where we live, it worked, okay? And I think it was a rather early, unsophisticated attempt in 2016. We should not expect that we need to repair the sort of thing that we saw in 16. 18 and 20 are going to be more sophisticated. So I think we've got work to do, and we better get on with it. I mean, we can hold only so many of these panels. We need to get on with the hard work at hand.
Well, so to that end, and specifically about the sophistication of these attacks, and they are multi-layered, it's not just election infrastructure, it's a whole host of other things. Rick, so I think putting this effort in Homeland Security as opposed to the Election Assistance Commission, which is a 30-person agency that does a lot of election policy nationally, was a good idea, and I think the right thing to do. But obviously DHS doesn't do everything. So who else are you guys working with across the national security community, and what other things are you guys working on? Like, do you guys work on the fake news issue, or is that somebody else? And how are you leveraging intelligence and so on that other agencies are gathering to help state and locals defend against this stuff?
So we don't work on the fake news issue. Our lane is security, and that's where we focus our efforts and supporting, particularly with the election stuff, supporting the state and local community. We work, clearly this is a whole of government approach, so the FBI is heavily engaged in the work that we are doing, as well as the intelligence community, and getting that information and getting it as declassified as we can, so that we can share it as broadly as we can, so that the state and local officials can take action where needed. We're doing really a whole host of things. So one of the things that we stood up inside the organization is an election task force to really kind of bring everybody together very, very quickly to get things organized and provide some resources so that we could come up with a plan of how we were going to engage with the state and local community. This was not late last year, but mid last year to do that. And we brought the FBI in that. We've brought DOD in on that. We've brought the National Guard, as well as members of the intelligence community in on those efforts. So from an administration perspective, this is a priority for us, and we're using a whole of government approach. Any resources that we can find, anybody that is in this lane, we are leveraging it to provide support to the state and local election officials.
Fantastic. Greg, so one last thing for you. It seems that that there's been some bipartisan cooperation on this. As we were saying in the green room, or whatever that room is over there, that this thing's dead in the water if there isn't bipartisan cooperation. So you mentioned Langford is co-sponsoring this bill. Are you seeing both sides of the aisle willing to work together on this? And if so, how does that look?
It's hard to say right now. The last iteration of that bill came out in December, right before the holiday, and Congress goes on vacation over the Christmas break, as we call it. And we've just come back, and I think everyone is all consumed right now, frankly, with the DREAM Act, CHIP, and the funding bill. So there are some supporters out there. I think if you look at Senator Rubio, he was a co-sponsor. I think it was the Deter Act, which dealt with sanctions against Russia, and if they were to influence or to meddle in anything in the U.S. again. So you do have some Republicans that are willing to get on board. I think it'll be easy to get the votes from the Democratic caucus. We just have to get enough from the Republicans, and to ensure that Leader McConnell will call it for a vote. And so I'm going to be optimistic about it. And I mentioned some headwinds. They come from Pennsylvania Avenue at times, but I think we can get there.
All right. So we do have time for questions from the audience, and I think online as well. But yeah, sure. Why don't we start? Go ahead. You in the black shirt.
Thank you. Thanks. My name is Sanford Morgenstein. I'm a novelist and a filmmaker, currently working on a film about election hacking. Ambassador, please, when you talk about paper ballots, remember that paper ballots are counted by computers. And the only way for paper ballots to be, and by the way, if people think a hacking problem is electronic voting touchscreens, I would bet that 90% of the vote, maybe even more today, is cast on paper ballots. Paper ballots, in terms of security, are useless unless they're mandated to be audited. You mentioned auditing, but paper ballots by themselves, remember, paper ballots, fill in the oval, are counted by computers, the same computers that are equally as vulnerable to hacking as the touchscreens. And to you, Secretary Driggers, Department of Homeland Security and its checks and balances, there's the small issue of Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. which says the states determine the manner of their elections. And despite the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which you, Mr. Bales, is it? A state like Pennsylvania does not require paper ballots. Pennsylvania was crucial in the last presidential election. The states determine how the manner of elections, including what machines are used, what audits will be used, if any. This has to be solved not by, well, it has to be solved by the federal government because we have 50 states. But it has to be solved in a way that takes into account the constitutional mandate of Article 2, Section 2.
So let me just quickly comment. I mean, you're right. I shorthanded the move to paper argument. Most paper ballots are fed through machines, optical scanners. That's how your vote is read. The key there is that those optical scanners do not have to have a direct connection to the internet. And that's what I meant by taking it off the, breaking it from the internet. And as you mentioned, the real value of the paper is that if you mandate risk reduction audits, because you have the paper and the capability to do that audit, you can then, with a relatively small sample size, scientifically proven, back up the outcome of the election and back up the confidence of the voting public in the casting of the vote. So that's the beauty of paper. It's not simply the direct connection to the internet. You're right.
One of the things that I think is critically important in this, and especially if this is, and we believe it is, part of an overall influence campaign that the Russians are trying to do to make us question our democracy and our leaders, our elected leaders and so on, is to instill trust and transparency into the system. And one of the things that we've seen done, I believe, in somewhere in Northern California, maybe Berkeley or something, I forget, they're actually PDFing all of the ballots and putting them online so that anybody can go in and audit the election. And I think that level of transparency is critically important for this. Go ahead, ma'am.
I hope that especially the DHS and the EAC are also, and Senator Durbin's bill as well, considering chain of custody for our ballots, because that's another weak point in localities. Chain of custody, where they're placing them, how are they securing them before any recounts, before any audits, and if Mr. Is it Driggers? Okay, could you say something about VPNs? Because here in Cook County and Chicago, we transmit our results on election night over a VPN and the vulnerabilities of that. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to go into deep discussion about the vulnerabilities of a virtual private network, because it depends on what that virtual private network is, the infrastructure behind it, the systems and all that, so in the software that are running those. So it could be all sorts of things. It depends on how the systems are configured, the software that you're running, what type of antivirus software is on there. All of those types of things go into that. So the bottom line is, and I think that the ambassador pointed to it, if you have a system that's connected to the internet, and if it's a VPN, a virtual private network, it is, then you are subject to a vulnerability or are accepting a risk. Unless you put in protection protocols and you have people monitoring your network and you understand what the adversary is looking for and the threat information and things of that nature. So that that has to be taken into account. Just real quick, I want to go back to the gentleman's point here that with regards to the Constitution, and I want to make this clear: the Department of Homeland Security's role in this is security focused, and it's security focused to support the state and local officials. It's not to tell them what to do or to tell them how to do it. It's to support with our resources, the subject matter expertise that we have, the tools that we have, and the capabilities that we have, if in fact a state and local election official requests that support.
So I want to take a question online on Twitter or whatever we're getting these from.
The green room.
Yeah, right. They keep moving around. Okay, there's a question that is basically, and Doug, or Ambassador Lute, I'll turn this to you first. What's the risk of foreign intelligence operatives compromising poll workers and election officials? And more importantly, If there is a risk there, what do we do to deal with it?
Look, I suppose there's some risk of that, but this is not, you probably watched the show The Americans or something, right? I mean, this is not a Russian agent, somehow compromising one of NOAA's workers in some precinct in Chicago that's going to seriously undermine the election. That would be to do that at scale would be so difficult that that's probably an advantage of our very decentralized system, right? Because you can't just mount that scale of kind of Cold War vintage classic intelligence operations. Where we're vulnerable is where the internet has given us efficiencies, I think as my colleagues mentioned, as in the amassing of the voter registration data into a very convenient spreadsheet, and all the names and addresses and middle initials are all there, easily hacked and easily corrupted. So that if you change my middle initial and it no longer matches my driver's license, I don't even get to the ballot, right? That's a lot easier than recruiting, a spy or an agent inside 8,000 voting jurisdictions. It's a lot easier than that, right? You can simply hack into the voter registration database, suppress the vote, and if you do that in a targeted way, and here I don't want to say too much in a public arena because maybe I'll tip the Russians off how to do this, right? But if you look at the demographics and you look at swing states and you look at vulnerable districts or districts with a small margin, right, that you don't have to hack all 8,000. You can go after the ones that might make a difference according to your influence campaign. That's where we're vulnerable, and that's where we need to wake up as Americans.
Next. Let's see. Missing the blue? Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Are any of your organizations working with the Census Bureau? The census is coming up in a few years, and I know that they're testing allowing households to register online, and so it could have major implications for congressional district assignments for a whole decade if that is influenced in any way.
Rick, I'll let you.
Yeah, so we are, I don't know if we're working with them on that specific project, but we do work with the Census Bureau and help provide some tools and services to not only help protect their network, but also to help with other programs with our incident response capabilities and things like that. So we work with all of the departments and agencies, all the civilian executive branch department and agencies with regards to the capabilities and services that we have at the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay. You, sir, and yep, you, yes.
If you accept, sure, okay, thanks, Chad. If you accept the premise that our nuclear arsenal keeps us safe from a nuclear attack as an effective deterrent, you should accept the premise that an offensive capability would also protect us from an attack. Should the United States be trying to get Mickey Mouse or Betty Boop elected second in the Russian election to demonstrate that we have some abilities of our own, what should we be thinking about in terms of offensive capabilities? To the extent that you can talk about what we are already doing, that would be great too, but is offense part of our defense here the way it has been for other security issues?
We've been talking about deterrence theory and cybersecurity a lot since the 2016 election. So Doug, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, there's really not much to say here that we can say, right? But, but I would say I think you're onto something in terms of thinking of what might be called a Cold War concept, that is deterrence, right? That is that if you try to do this against me, you're going to be sorry because I'm going to raise the cost so sufficiently that it will not be worth your while. So that approach. But thinking about how that applies to the cyber arena, not only in election security in terms of cyber security, but in terms of other dimensions of cyber security. It took us about 15 years of Cold War study to figure out deterrence theory as applied to nuclear weaponry. It's going to take us a while to get our arms around how to apply it in the cyber arena. And one of the big challenges here, of course, is attribution, right? If you don't know exactly who you're threatening, then that's a problem. Which is, again, one reason why the 16 intelligence agency finding that it was a particular actor at a particular level is so revealing. We should not always expect that it's going to be so obvious. And this is why I think 2016 was a little clumsy. They left fingerprints. I think they will learn from that. The next attack is likely to be harder to attribute, and therefore harder to deter. But I do think I think there is a deterrence logic here that we're only beginning to consider. And it may have offensive and defensive qualities.
And we, of course, live in the glassiest of glass houses in this particular scenario, right? So much of our economy and our society is relying on the internet, potentially more so than any other country on the planet. Okay, a couple more. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. My question is, with all the congressional committees that seem to be focusing on Russia and collusion, are any of them actually looking at what steps we should be taking to avoid this in the future?
Greg, do you want to?
Yeah, Senator Mark Warner, ranking member on intelligence, publicly announced just the other day that they are looking to put out some proactive measures and suggested ideas as a guideline for how we stop this in the future. And we should see something public this month or next from them. So hopeful for that.
And it may have a deterrence dimension. It may have a defense dimension, but it may have a deterrence dimension as well.
Yes, sir. In the red.
My main concern is the tabulation of votes. You've talked about various aspects of this, and you've kind of been shifting around, but ultimately the tabulation of votes is the most important thing. And I think the solution is hand-counted paper ballots. The problem is cyber. The cyber security is the problem. If we have things on paper, we don't have to rely on cyber. Our votes should be hand-counted paper ballots. That's what's done in Germany now. Because in Germany there was a case in 2009 where the High Court decided that the electronic tabulation of votes was inherently undemocratic. And that's absolutely right. As a poll watcher myself, I know that the first time I poll watched when I was 18 years old, we actually had paper ballots that all the poll watchers could see. Now everything's counted by machines. We see nothing. That's our biggest vulnerability. It's not foreign governments. It's ourselves. It's our own election commissions. There's no transparency to the counting of our votes now because they're counted on machines. A poll watcher in a polling place does nothing to observe the count. So I'll just leave with this. In the 1870s, Boss Tweed, the Tammany Hall character, said, as long as I'm counting the votes, what are you going to do about it? That's our number one vulnerability, not Russia.
Thank you.
Anyone can take that.
I'll just comment on it. And Noah, I like we keep pointing you out today. Probably remembers 2014, we had in Illinois a contested state treasurer's race. There's like 10,000 some precincts in Illinois, and he ended up, the current treasurer, Michael Frericks, won by 10,000 some votes. And it came down to a lot of manual tabulation of mail-in ballots and paper ballots from across the state to figure out the final tabulation because it was that close. But I think that's kind of just to agree with you that we do look at paper ballots as important.
So let me just comment that you're right, there's an election system here. It's not a single point of vulnerability. I've been harping this evening on voter registration because I think that's a big soft target, but tabulation's another part, right, and so forth. But there's actually two broader dimensions of this problem. There's the physical changing of the vote, the physical corruption of the vote, right? So changing the tabulation, for example, right? What I'm even more worried about is the psychological dimension of this. So that if the American voting public loses confidence that his or her vote is actually going to count towards a democratic outcome, doesn't mean you always win, right? But it counts. That the erosion of confidence is actually a bigger vulnerability in the long run because that could suppress the vote nationally in a way that is an even more severe vulnerability in my view. But there's both the physical and the psychological. And the physical has multiple steps. So someone else mentioned the chain of custody, right? Eventually, this stuff all gets compiled, sometimes in mail trucks, you know? And I mean, so there are many places where you could interfere with the system. But the big vulnerabilities, I think, at least in my study of this, is the voter registration database in terms of its being on the internet. And then the second is this loss of confidence. And I think we may, given as much press as this is now getting, and given the 2016 experience, I wonder if we're not on the edge of eroded confidence in our system.
We should be. You should have already lost confidence.
Well, that's why we're here tonight.
Yeah, right.
Counts, there is no transparency.
Okay, so I think we're out of time, and so thanks everybody on the panel for coming, especially those who flew out. I know people are missing family birthdays and everything, so we appreciate that, and thank you all for having us.